So looking at foundations for our colonial government, going back to the 13th century in England, so 1215, we have something called the Magna Carta. So what was going on is King John, in around 1215, he was a wealthy, powerful king, and the people, he was taking advantage of the people. So he was using his power and his wealth to say, I'm in charge, what I want, we're going to do. And if you don't like it, oh well. And the people of England were not happy at that. They didn't want that sort of rule. So what they did is they basically ganged up and they stormed the castle and said, look, bud, we need you to sign something. We need you to put some sort of documentation in law saying that the king does not have complete control and complete power. This is not a dictatorship. This is a constitutional monarchy where there has to be some sense of rule of law. So what they did is the nobles, which were like the wealthy and the higher ups in society, who were trying to look out for some of the social middle class, forced him to sign something called the Magna Carta, which translates to the Great Charter or the Great Contract. So some of the things that he agreed to do was, first of all, this idea of rule of law. So the Magna Carta established this idea that everybody, even the king, has to fall within the bounds of the law. So it guaranteed English political and civil liberties and rights to all nobles and freemen. So one of our vocab words today was rights. And these are the opportunities, the liberties, the freedoms that people have that even those in charge cannot take away without good cause or without good reason. King John also was forced to agree to no taxation without consent by a council of prominent men. So in other words, this was saying that people, if they're going to pay taxes, they had to at least vote on these taxes, and they had to ensure that certain rights were going to be put in place. Oops, sorry about that. So other things were a right to a trial by jury of their peers. All right, so this goes into our Fifth Amendment right, and also the right to elect representatives of government. So right within this Magna Carta, we see things like rule of law, we see representative government, we see individual rights. So a lot of these principles of democracy were shown in this first charter all the way back in 13th century England. Now, why do we bring that up now? Because fast forward to King George in the 18th century, he was starting to go away from some of these ideals, these ideas of rights and rule of law. And so the American colonists wanted it to get back to where it was supposed to be. So again, the Magna Carta was really a foundation of modern American democracy because it protected individual human rights. So in terms of governing the colonies, in the 1650s, the Navigation Acts were passed, and this regulated trade between England and the colonies. So this was a set of laws that the King of England in 1650 passed to say, we're going to have some semblance of order with how we trade, who we trade with, and how it's done. Now, this helped the colonies, but many resented them because it gave the English government too much control. So this is an example of the English government saying, we're going to decide things, and we're not necessarily going to let you take a vote. We're going to tell you how it's going to be, and if you like it, cool. If not, then you're going to have to live with it. So political life in the colonies, and again, politics are basically how you go about your business, what your views are, what your preferences are. So each colony had its own elected legislature. And we talked about the House of Burgesses in Jamestown. We talked about town hall meetings in New England. So this legislature is a group of people that makes laws, and it was split up into two houses, what we call a bicameral legislature. So there's an upper house, which had a little bit more authority, and a lower house, which didn't have as much. So the upper house was made of a governor, and the governor appointed advisors. So these weren't voted on by the people. The governor basically chose who he wanted to have helping him. And then the lower house was made of elected representatives. So there was some semblance of representative government, but it was more in the lower house and not the upper house. So those who had more power and authority, they were appointed by members over in England to say, you're going to be our governor. And then that governor gets to choose who he wants to serve him as his advisors. The lower house, which had not as much authority, but they had some type of representative government style, those were made by elected officials. So in the 17th century, in 1689, there's also some turmoil going on over in England, and there was some turnover. So there was a change in command. And stepping to the throne were people named William and Mary, a husband and wife. And they didn't like how the previous monarchy, the previous king, was mistreating the British subjects. So they vowed to issue a Bill of Rights that was going to be written out. So no longer was it, yeah, trust us, we'll take care of you. It's now going to be, we're going to put it in writing. And this was a precedent that was set. So when we created our own Constitution in 1787, when America officially became a country, one of the things that a group known as the Anti-Federalists said is, we want to have a Bill of Rights put into this Constitution. We want it spelled out. We want it in writing. So that way the king couldn't go back on it. But, you know, if you know our American history, we have not had a king in American history. It's been elected representatives. And so our elected representatives, and then eventually our president, who is the head of our government, is not going to have free reign to do whatever they want. So this idea of rule of law and limited government and individual rights and liberties would be protected. So some of these rights included right to trial by jury, which we saw in the Magna Carta. And now it's in this English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights also protected people from unfair taxes that were issued by the throne. So again, going back to the Magna Carta, 400 years later, history is repeating itself, and those in charge are kind of abusing their power and using their power the wrong way. Sadly, though, these rights were restricted to white male property owners. So if you were a woman, if you were an African American, if you were a Native American, if you were a foreign-born citizen, you were not granted these same rights and liberties. And sadly, that was not extended until 1870, when the 14th Amendment was passed in our country. So there starts to get to be rebellion that's occurring in the colonies in the 17th century, not just from slaves, which we talked about, but we see angry farmers who are being taxed unfairly by Governor William Berkeley of Virginia. And so here we see somebody who's got power is abusing their power and thinks that they are above the law. So a guy named Francis Bacon and some of his fellow farmers revolt and rebel against Governor Berkeley. And they let it be known that they didn't like being taxed unfairly. They didn't like seeing a governor who was using their power to help him, but not to help out the citizens and the constituents he was supposed to be serving. So they marched to Jamestown and burned down the Capitol. So it got violent, and they attacked the government. And afterwards, the House of Burgesses, which was our representative body in Jamestown, passed laws to prevent a royal governor from assuming too much power ever again. So we saw it in England in 1215 when they attacked the king and said, we're going to force you to sign documentation saying that you're going to follow the rule of law. We see it now again in 1676 in the colony of Jamestown, or in what eventually became the state of Virginia, the colony of Virginia. So this was an important step against tyranny, and it showed that there has to be limits on government. So if you take anything away from this PowerPoint presentation, it's that the people want a limit to the government's power. So we wanted limited government within our colonies. So fast forwarding then to a guy named John Locke. John Locke was a philosopher who came over from England, and he was one of the first to promote this idea of natural rights. So he said in a couple of his publications that he said that it doesn't make sense that kings have a God-given right to rule. And Thomas Paine, when he wrote Common Sense, later echoed that and said, you know what? Yeah, these kings feel that because they're born into royalty, they just automatically get to be the most powerful person. That would be like saying that my children are automatically going to be great teachers because some people consider me to be a great teacher. Or it would be like believing that because Donald Trump is our current president at this time of the recording, that his children, his sons, Eric and Donald Jr., are going to be great leaders just because some people consider Donald Trump to be a strong leader. Conversely, it also doesn't make sense to think that his offspring are going to be bad leaders just because some people consider President Trump to be a bad leader. So what John Locke posed is that every human is born with natural rights, and among these are the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So people have the right to pursue whatever goal that they want to pursue. They have the right to live the life that they feel they should live, and government should not step on those rights or should not take away those rights or should not tell people what to do unless they have a good reason for doing so. And he believed in the idea of human progress, or in other words, improving in society. So he feels that things are not going to work out the same way in the future the way that they do now. So times are always changing. Things are always changing. Things are always progressing. So this idea that just because your dad was a king, you automatically should become king by birth, and that your son should become a king because you were a king. He says that that's a stupid idea. And Thomas Paine later goes on to say that it makes common sense to say that the best person should be in charge, not just because, you know, your family has royal ties. So we start to see in the 16th, 17th, 18th century America that the English government is doing things not the way that's going to help out the people. And so people wanted a change. They realized that governmental power should be limited. And remember that the primary reason that these colonists wanted independence from England, as we start to get into looking at declaring independence, is that they wanted to start a new democratic form of government. They didn't want it to be run by a monarchy where a king makes all the rules and the British Parliament or the government that serves under the king automatically just follows the rules that the king says. The people of the colonies, the people of society should have a voice and should have a hand in this government.